Hey there. Tonight, we slip behind the tall iron gates of a great English house, past the gravel drive and the sleeping peacocks, into a world of marble staircases, whispered scandals, and gowns that cost more than a village earns in a year. Tonight, you become a Victorian Duchess, the most envied woman in all of England. And, as you're about to discover, quite possibly the most exhausted. Before we begin, take a slow breath, and if you're genuinely enjoying these quiet journeys into the past, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. I always love picturing all of us, scattered across the world, drifting off to the same old stories. Now dim the lights. Sink into your pillows. Let your shoulders fall. And let's step gently into a single day in the life of a duchess, a day that begins, like all of hers, before you are remotely ready for it. Congratulations. You have just woken up as a Victorian Duchess. The good news: you are rich beyond the wildest dreams of almost everyone alive in 1870. The bad news: you are also colder than almost everyone alive in 1870, because a house with 200 rooms is, structurally speaking, a very beautiful way to be freezing in several directions at once. You wake not to sunlight, but to the soft, deliberate sound of a young housemaid who has already been awake for 3 hours. She crept in before dawn, knelt at your hearth, cleaned out yesterday's ashes, and built you a fresh fire, all in near darkness, all in total silence, because waking the Duchess too early is a sin somewhere just below treason. By the time you open your eyes, the room is glowing, the curtains are being drawn back inch by careful inch, and a fire is crackling as though it had always been there. Magic, you might think. No. Just Sarah. Sarah is 14. Sarah's knees are already ruined. Your bed is a vast four-poster, hung with heavy embroidered curtains drawn tight against the night air, because the night air, according to every doctor of the century, is actively trying to murder you. You sleep in a tinted box of velvet and goose down, in a linen nightgown, under blankets stacked like geological layers, and still, somehow, the tip of your nose is cold. This is the great secret of the aristocracy that the paintings never show you. They were all, every single one of them, a little bit cold all of the time, for their entire lives. You do not leap out of bed. Duchesses do not leap. Duchesses do not, generally, do anything quickly, because hurrying suggests you have somewhere urgent to be, and a duchess, by definition, is the place everyone else is urgently trying to get to. So you lie there a moment longer in your warm velvet cave, listening to the house wake up around you, distant doors, the clink of coal scuttles, the faint thunder of servants moving through corridors you will never see, in a wing you have possibly never entered, doing work you have certainly never imagined. And then the day begins. Not with your decision. With the arrival of your lady's maid. Her name is Dawson. You call her by her surname, always, because that is how it is done, and she calls you, Your Grace, always, because the one time a new maid called you, Ma'am. She was quietly corrected by the housekeeper, and never made that mistake again. Dawson is the single most important person in your daily life, and you would be genuinely helpless without her, a fact you both know and neither of you will ever say out loud. She is about to spend the next 90 minutes turning you from a cold, rumpled woman into a duchess, and it is going to be a great deal of work, most of it performed on your behalf while you stand very still and think about other things. But before any of that, Before the gowns and the jewels and the small architectural marvel of your hair, there is the matter of getting clean. And here, even in the grandest house in the county, the 19th century has some surprises for you. None of them are pleasant, and all of them are cold. There is no bathroom. Let me say that again, because it deserves a moment of silence. In a house that has a room specifically for arranging flowers, a room for the gentleman to smoke, a room for breakfast, and a separate room for dinner, and roughly 40 bedrooms, there is, in 1870, very probably no room with a bath in it. Plumbing is coming. Plumbing is on its way, gleaming and modern and wonderful. But it has not arrived yet, and the aristocracy, who could afford it first, were often the slowest to want it, because what need has a Duchess of Pipes when she has people? So your bath comes to you. It is a hip bath, a shallow tin tub shaped a little like a slipper, carried into your dressing room by housemaids, who then begin the long, thankless ballet of the cans. Hot water is heated in the kitchens, far below, in great coppers over the range. It is then poured into heavy metal cans, and those cans are carried up flights of stairs, along corridors, up more stairs, by young women in starched aprons, who arrive slightly out of breath and absolutely forbidden to show it. By the time the water reaches you, it is, at best, warm. By the time you actually get into it, it is making a serious bid for cold. You will wash quickly. You will wash with cold-pressed soap that smells faintly of almonds if you are fortunate, and faintly of tallow if you are not. And you will be out, shivering, wrapped in warm towels, in approximately the time it takes to regret your entire situation. And here is the part nobody tells you. You do not do this every day. Daily, full immersion bathing is, in 1870, considered slightly eccentric, possibly unhealthy, and definitely a great deal of trouble for the staff. A proper, sit-down bath might happen once or twice a week. The rest of the time, you are cleaned by what was politely called a wash, a basin, a jug, a sponge, and a great deal of dignity. You will scrub it yourself in sections, like a woman dusting a very expensive vase, and you will call it sufficient, because everyone you have ever met has the exact same relationship with water, and it would never occur to any of you that there might be another way to live. Now you are clean, more or less, and damp, and cold, and standing in the middle of your dressing room in your shift, which is the thin linen layer that sits closest to your skin and will, by the end of this process, be buried under so many other garments that you will essentially be wearing a building. Dawson stands ready. On the chairs and the bed, and hung from the great wardrobe doors, is the morning's architecture, laid out in order, and you are about to be assembled like a cathedral, from the foundations up. We begin, of course, with the corset. And I'm sorry to tell you, but this is where your day, and possibly your ribcage, takes a turn. The corset goes on over the shift, and it is not the medieval torture device of cartoon imagination, but it is also absolutely not comfortable, and anyone who tells you Victorian women were perfectly at ease in their stays has never been laced into one by a determined woman who has done this 9,000 times and has frankly stopped feeling sorry for you. It is a stiffened garment, boned with whalebone or steel, that wraps your torso and laces tightly up the back. And the key word, the word that will define your entire physical existence as a duchess, is back. The laces are behind you. You cannot reach them. You did not put this on yourself, and you will not take it off yourself, and that single fact tells you almost everything about your life. You are a woman who, quite literally, cannot get dressed or undressed without another person. Independence, for you, is not a value. It is not even an option. It is a thing that happens to other, poorer women, and you have been raised to pity them for it. Dawson takes the laces. She braces. And she pulls. You exhale, because you have learned, the way all women of your class learn, to breathe out and hold still as the world tightens around your middle. The fashionable silhouette of your decade demands a waist that is, frankly, an opinion rather than a fact, and you are about to have one negotiated onto you by leverage. You feel your lower ribs draw in. You feel your posture change, not because you are choosing to sit up straight, but because the corset has removed slouching from the menu entirely. You could not slump now if the house were on fire. This is, the magazines assure you, elegance. Your liver has a different word for it. Here is the truth the lurid stories get wrong, though, so let's be fair to your corset. You are not being laced down 4 inches into a wasp. That happened, occasionally, to a very small number of very dramatic women who took it to extremes and whom everyone else considered a bit much. For most ladies, the corset is less an instrument of torture and more an instrument of permanent, low-level reminder, a firm, bone hug from a relative who disapproves of you, worn from morning until night, every day, for your whole life. You will eat in it. You will write in it. You will laugh in it, carefully, from the top of your lungs only, because the bottom of your lungs is, at present, out of service. And you will think nothing of it, because you have worn one since you were a girl, and a body without a corset feels, to you, alarmingly like a tent with no poles. Over the corset comes the chemise's companions, the drawers, the petticoats, layer upon layer of them, starched and frilled, each one adding warmth and width and weight. Then the crinoline, or, by the 1870s, its sleeker successor, the bustle, a structure of steel hoops or horsehair pads designed to push your skirts out behind you into a fashionable cascade, so that you may sweep through doorways like a galleon under sail and knock small ornaments off side tables in passing. You will learn to manage all of this with a grace that looks effortless and is, in fact, the result of 2 decades of practice. Sitting down becomes an art form. You do not flop into a chair. You gather, you lower, you arrange, a controlled descent, like a hot air balloon coming gently down in a field. And finally, the gown itself, fastened up the back with what feels like 100 tiny buttons and hooks, each one done up by Dawson's patient fingers while you stand with your arms slightly raised, gazing at the middle distance, being dressed. By the time she is finished, you are wearing somewhere between 15 and 30 separate pieces of clothing, and you weigh appreciably more than you did when you woke up. You have not yet had breakfast. You have not yet spoken to another adult. And you are already, by any reasonable measure, exhausted. But you cannot be tired. Not yet. Because your hair has not even been touched, and your hair, my dear Duchess, is about to take longer than everything else combined. So you sit at your dressing table, before a mirror in a frame of gilded curlicues, and you surrender your head to Dawson for the next portion of the morning. And it is a portion. Victorian hair is not a hairstyle. It is a feat of engineering, a small monument raised daily to the gods of respectability, and it requires materials, tools, and the patience of a stonemason. First, your hair is brushed out, and there is a great deal of it, because you have never in your life cut it short, and the idea of doing so would scandalize your mother, your husband, and possibly your bishop. It falls past your waist when loose, though almost no one outside this room has ever seen it that way. Loose hair is for the bedroom, and the bedroom only. A grown woman with her hair down in public might as well be ringing a bell and shouting. So Dawson brushes and oils and begins to build. She rolls and pins and twists, patting the shape out over little pads of horsehair called rats. Yes, rats, tucked discreetly underneath to give your coiffure its fashionable fullness. She secures the whole structure with a quantity of hairpins that would set off every metal detector ever invented, were such a thing to exist, which, mercifully for airport security, it does not. And here is a quiet little horror for you to fall asleep to. You do not wash this hair often. Washing long hair in 1870 means soaking it, and then drying it with no machine and no warmth but the fire, a process that can take the better part of a day and leave you chilled to the bone. So it is done rarely, perhaps once a month, perhaps less. Between washes, the oils build, the powders are brushed through, the structure is taken down each night and rebuilt each morning, and the whole thing is held together by sheer force of pins and social necessity. Your magnificent hair, the crown of your respectability, is, if we are being honest, somewhat less than fresh. But so is everyone's. And in a world where no one's is a problem. And then there is your face. And here the Victorian rules grow strangest of all, because the great ideal of your decade is to look as though you have done absolutely nothing to it. Visible cosmetics, paint, rouge openly worn, these are the marks of an actress or a woman of a certain reputation, and a respectable duchess must never, ever appear to be made up. The fashionable face is pale, smooth, untouched, dewy, and entirely natural looking, which is, of course, a tremendous amount of work to achieve while pretending to do none of it. So your dressing table holds a quiet arsenal of preparations applied with a careful, deniable hand, lotions and creams to keep the complexion soft and white, a discreet dusting of pearl or rice powder to take away any vulgar shine, perhaps the faintest, most plausibly natural hint of color rubbed into lips and cheeks and immediately blotted away to leave only a suggestion. The whole art is invisibility. A lady must look beautiful, and must look as though her beauty cost her nothing, because to be caught trying is nearly as bad as being plain. And the pursuit of that pale, untouched complexion could be quietly dangerous, for not every preparation sold to the hopeful women of the age was harmless. Some skin whiteners and complexion washes of this century contained lead, or arsenic, or other slow poisons, promising a fashionable pallor and delivering, over years, real harm. The ghastly irony of women damaging the very skin they were poisoning themselves to perfect. You guard your face against the sun above all, for a tan is the mark of a laboring woman who must work out of doors, and a lady's whole claim to gentility is written in the untouched whiteness of her skin. So you carry a parasol against the daylight. You wear a veil and gloves. You preserve your pallor as carefully as you preserve your reputation, because in the strange arithmetic of your world they are nearly the same thing. Both of them prove that you are a woman who has never had to do anything for herself, which is, after all, the entire point of being a duchess. By the time the last pin slides home, an hour or more has passed since you sat down. You have been bathed, laced, padded, buttoned, and built. You are, at last, a duchess from the skin outward. You rise, carefully, and survey yourself in the long glass, composed, upholstered, magnificent, and faintly resentful. And only now, fully assembled, are you permitted to go downstairs and do the single most aristocratic thing of all. You are permitted to eat a small breakfast very slowly while several people watch. Breakfast, blessedly, is one of the gentler trials of your day, because it is one of the few meals at which you are allowed to behave like a slightly informal human being. You drift down to the breakfast room, a smaller, sunnier chamber than the great dining hall, because no one wants to begin the day shouting across 40 feet of mahogany, and you find the sideboard already laid. And what a sideboard! This is the famous English breakfast of the upper classes, and it is, frankly, deranged in its abundance. Beneath a row of silver covers, kept warm by little spirit lamps, sits enough food to provision a modest expedition. Eggs in 3 forms, bacon and kidneys and curling rashers of ham. Kedgeree, that curious dish of rice and smoked fish and egg that the Empire brought home from India and the gentry adopted with enthusiasm. Cold game pie. Grilled kippers, fragrant enough to announce themselves from the next county. Toast in a silver rack, already going cold in the principled English manner, because warm toast is the mark of a household that has lost its nerve. Pots of marmalade and honey. Fruit from the hothouses, where gardeners coax peaches and even pineapples out of the reluctant English climate at a cost that would make a banker weep. And tea, of course. Always tea. You help yourself. Yes, yourself, from the sideboard, one of the rare moments of self-service in your entire pampered existence, and you sit, and you eat a fraction of what is on offer, because a duchess does not pile her plate like a farmhand at harvest. The rest of this groaning spread will be cleared away, and what is not eaten by the upper servants in their own hall will be repurposed, sent down, or simply absorbed into the vast digestive machinery of a great house, where almost nothing is ever truly thrown away, and almost everything is, somehow, somewhere, eaten by somebody. You think nothing of it. You have never once in your life wondered where the food comes from, or where it goes, or what it costs. That is precisely what makes you a duchess. The breakfast room is, for an hour, one of the gentler corners of your day. The light comes in low and golden across the silver and the white cloth. Perhaps the Duke is there, hidden behind the broad pages of his newspaper, exchanging with you the small mild courtesies of 2 people who have shared a roof for decades, a comment on the weather, on a letter, on a guest expected later in the week. Perhaps a house guest or 2 drift in, sleepy and pleasant, and the talk stays light, for it is too early in the day for the real warfare to begin. There is a stillness to it, a kind of upholstered peace, the calm before the long performance of the day cranks fully into motion. And beneath your feet, separated from this golden quiet by nothing but a few feet of floorboard, the kitchens are an inferno of labor, the cook red-faced and roaring over her range, the scullery maid already at her second mountain of pans, the whole hot machinery that produced this serene abundance running at full and frantic speed so that you might sit, in the soft morning light, and decide, languidly, whether or not you can manage a little more toast. 2 worlds, one above the other, joined by a bell pull, and separated by everything else. And you, in the upper one, have never once heard the noise of the lower. Around you, the morning post arrives on a silver salver, and here your real work begins, because the great misunderstanding about your life, the thing the India shopgirl reading her penny novel never grasps, is that being a duchess is a job. It is an unpaid, inescapable, lifelong job, and its chief labor is correspondence. You write letters. You write a staggering, relentless volume of letters, every single day, in your own hand, because a lady of your standing does not have a secretary scribbling on her behalf like some grubby man of business. There are invitations to issue and invitations to decline, each in precisely the correct degree of warmth. There are thank you notes, condolence notes, congratulation notes, and the delicate, coded notes by which the entire social world is governed. There are letters to your children at school, to your sisters and aunts and cousins flung across other great houses, to the dozens of people whose goodwill is the invisible currency your position runs on. A duchess who lets her correspondence slip is a duchess whose influence quietly drains away, and influence is the only thing you actually possess. The houses, the jewels, the land, those belong to your husband, or to his family, or to the entail, that grim legal contraption that ensures everything passes intact to the next male heir. What is yours, what is truly and only yours, is your social power. And it is maintained one carefully worded note at a time. And then there is the matter of calls. Of all the elaborate rituals that govern your day, none is so finely, maddeningly detailed as the system of the morning call, which, in the perverse logic of your world, does not take place in the morning at all. A morning call happens in the afternoon. Of course it does. You were expecting consistency? From a society that dresses for dinner at a different time than it eats it? The rules are these, and you must know them in your bones, because to break them is to brand yourself a fool. A call lasts 15 to 30 minutes. Not longer. To overstay is a small crime. You arrive, you are announced, you sit, you make pleasant and entirely weightless conversation about the weather, the health of mutual acquaintances, and absolutely nothing of any substance whatsoever, and then you rise and depart before you have outstayed your precisely measured welcome. You leave your calling card, a small rectangle of stiff paper bearing your name, the single most important piece of stationery you own, and the corners of that card are folded, or not folded, in ways that carry entire sentences of meaning that everyone understands and no one ever explains. A turned-down corner means you called in person. A particular fold conveys condolence, or congratulation, or farewell before a long journey. The cards left on the hall table of a great house are read like a ledger of who matters, who is rising, who is being quietly dropped. And the cruelty of the system, the thing that keeps the whole machine spinning, is that you may call upon a great lady, leave your card, and receive in return nothing. No card back. No invitation. A silence as eloquent and final as a slammed door. You have been weighed and found insufficiently grand, and there is no court of appeal. Equally, you yourself hold that same terrible power over the women just below you, the hopeful wives of the newly rich, who leave their cards on your table and wait, and watch, and learn whether the Duchess will acknowledge them or let them dangle. You did not invent this game. You were born into the middle of it, and you play it every single afternoon, with a smile, in a corset, because the alternative, opting out, does not exist for someone like you. You still have not done anything that a sensible person would call work. You have not cooked, or cleaned, or carried anything heavier than a teacup. And yet the day has its own gravity, its own relentless schedule, and the next thing it demands of you is that you go and command an army. Because beneath this beautiful house, a small nation of servants is waiting for the Duchess to tell them how the day will run. And running them is, whether you like it or not, entirely your job. A great Victorian house is not a home in the way you might think of one. It is an institution. It is a small, self-contained kingdom, with a population that can run from 12 to 50 souls or more, and like any kingdom, it has a strict and jealously guarded order of rank. There are the upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the cook, your own lady's maid, the master's valet, who consider themselves a kind of aristocracy of the basement, and who would be deeply offended to be confused with the lower servants, the housemaids, and footmen and scullery girls, and hall boys who do the endless grinding labor that keeps the whole apparition afloat. The hierarchy below stairs is, if anything, more rigid than the one above. A scullery maid does not speak to the butler unless spoken to. The upper servants dine separately, and in some houses the senior staff retire from the servants' hall to take their pudding in the housekeeper's room, a ritual so grand it has its own nickname, Pug's Parlor. You will spend your life vaguely aware of this shadow's society humming beneath your floorboards, and you will understand perhaps a tenth of it. Your point of contact with this kingdom is the housekeeper, a formidable woman in black, with a chatelaine of keys hanging at her waist that jingles softly as she walks, announcing her like a sergeant major in bombazine. Each morning she comes to you, and the two of you conduct the daily business of the house. You discuss the menus, though in truth the cook has already decided most of it, and you are largely approving her choices, and pretending you might have thought of them yourself. You discuss which rooms are to be cleaned, which linens aired, which silver polished. You hear, in the most delicate possible terms, about the small dramas of the staff, though never directly, never crudely, only in the careful euphemisms by which respectable women acknowledge that the third housemaid has been crying and the new footman is too friendly with her by half. And there are the keys. The housekeeper carries her great ring of them, but in the largest matters the authority is yours, for those keys unlock a kingdom of small treasures. The linen presses stacked with sheets, and napkins counted and recounted like bullion. The still-room where preserves and cordials and the finer delicacies are kept. The storerooms of tea and sugar and spices, which a century ago were precious enough to be locked away from the very servants who used them. There are the household accounts to be glanced over, vast in total, and yet composed of 1,000 tiny domestic sums, the candles, the coal, the meat, the wages, the endless small bleeding of a great house's costs, and though a steward and the housekeeper do the real reckoning, the Duchess sets the tone, decides the standard, says yes to this economy and no to that extravagance, and is held, in the end, quietly responsible for whether the whole vast establishment runs sweet or runs sour. It is, beneath the silk and the languor, a genuine administration. You are the unpaid managing director of a small, ancient, and very beautiful company, and the roll came with the ring on your finger. And here is the strange double truth of your power. You command this army, and yet you would be utterly helpless without it. You do not know how to light your own fire. You have never boiled an egg. You could not, if your life depended upon it, get yourself out of the gown you are currently wearing. You are the most powerful woman in the house, and the least capable of surviving in it alone, and these two facts are not a contradiction, they are the entire point. Helplessness is your luxury. Every single thing you cannot do is a thing someone else does for you, and the longer the list of things you cannot do, the grander you must be. A woman who can dress herself is a woman who cannot afford a maid. You wear your incompetence like a tiara. And it is worth, for a quiet moment, slipping down the back stairs in your imagination into the world that makes your world possible, because while you have been bathed and laced and fed, an entire second household has been laboring since before dawn in the cold rooms beneath your feet, and they will still be laboring long after you have gone to sleep. The day below stairs begins in darkness. The scullery maid, the lowest of them all, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, is up first, raking out and lighting the great kitchen range, hauling water, scrubbing the floors, and the endless mountain of pots before the cook descends. The housemaids creep through the silent house cleaning grates and laying fires in rooms that must be warmed before any of the family stirs, working invisibly, under a strict instruction in many houses that they should never, ever be seen at their work, that if a member of the family approaches, the housemaid should withdraw, even turn to face the wall, so that the magic of the effortless house is never broken by the sight of the effort. They carry the cans of hot water up flights of stairs for your bath. They empty the chamber pots and the slops, because in a house with no plumbing someone must, and that someone is a girl in a print dress who will never be thanked for it. The footmen, taller and better paid and chosen partly for their handsome calves, wait at table, carry messages, attend the carriage, and lend the house its display of liveried splendor. The butler reigns over the cellar and the silver and the dignity of the front of the house. The cook reigns over her kitchen like a monarch over a hot and tyrannical kingdom. Your lady's maid and the master's valet sit at the very top of the servants' tree, close to the family and quietly powerful. And all of them, from the scullery girl to the butler, work hours that would horrify a later century, rising before you, retiring after you, granted perhaps a half-day off a week and a rare Sunday, their lives folded entirely around the rhythm of yours. They are not permitted followers or sweethearts in many houses. They may be dismissed without a character, without a reference, for a small offense, and a servant dismissed without a character could starve. You preside, kindly enough, over this hidden kingdom, and you tell yourself, when you think of it at all, that they are content, that they are lucky to have such a good place, in such a great house. And perhaps some of them are. But their comfort is not your comfort, and their dawn is a great deal colder than yours, and the gulf between the woman in the four-poster and the girl raking the ashes beneath her is as wide as any in England, and very nearly as old. And over both worlds, the great house and the servants' hall alike, hangs the soft, insistent presence of faith, for this is a deeply religious age, and a great house keeps God on a schedule too. Many a household begins its day with family prayers, the duke or the chaplain reading a passage and a prayer in a great hall, while the entire staff stands ranged in order of precedence, the upper servants nearest the family, the scullery maid by the door, the whole hierarchy of the house assembled for a daily reminder of the order of things, divine and domestic alike. And Sunday rules the week. On Sunday the family processes to church, often a church on your own land, where your family has worshipped and been buried for centuries, where you have your own grand pew, set apart and sometimes raised above the rest, so that you may worship near God and above the village in the same comfortable instant. The tenants and the laborers fill the body of the church below. You sit in your box, in your sober Sunday best, and the vicar, who very likely owes his living to your family's gift, preaches contentment and duty and the rightness of each soul keeping to the station in which it has pleased God to place it. It is a faith that comforts the dying and steadies the grieving and orders the year with its festivals, and it is also, not at all by accident, a faith that tells the girl raking your ashes that her place beneath you is the will of heaven. You believe it, mostly, without examining it. Sunday is for rest, and for God, and for the quiet reassurance that the whole vast unequal edifice you sit atop is not merely customary but holy. By now it is past noon, and the house turns gently toward luncheon, a lighter, more informal affair than the great theater of dinner, taken in the smaller dining room, or, if you have guests, conducted with a touch more ceremony. Cold meats, perhaps a made dish or two, fruit, a little wine. You eat sparingly, as always, and you make conversation with whoever is staying in the house, for a duchess is rarely alone. There are almost always guests in residence, relatives passing through, a friend escaping her own duller establishment, a young cousin being quietly inspected as a possible match for someone. The house is a perpetual hotel that never sends a bill, and never quite empties, and you are its hostess from the moment you open your eyes to the moment you close them. And somewhere in this same great house, leading a life that runs alongside yours, like a parallel river that rarely crosses it, is your husband, the Duke. It is worth understanding how separate his world truly is from yours, because the gulf between them is one of the quiet shaping facts of your life. He has risen, very probably, to his own concerns entirely, his estates and their management, the rents and the harvests and the timber and the mines that fund this whole golden existence, his politics, for a duke very likely sits in the House of Lords and takes some hand, idle or earnest, in the governing of the kingdom, his clubs in town, those temples of male comfort where no woman may set foot, where he reads the papers and dines with other men, and conducts the half of life that happens beyond your reach. He has his own suite of rooms, his own valet, his own routines. In the country he shoots and hunts and rides over his acres. In town he goes to his club and his committees. He inhabits a man's sphere as total and as enclosed as your woman's sphere, and the two spheres meet, by the careful design of your whole civilization, at only a few appointed points, at dinner, at the great occasions, in the bedroom, and in the business of producing and placing the children who will carry the line forward. You may be fond of him. Many such couples were, in their measured way. Affection and respect, and a kind of companionable loyalty grew in the soil of these arranged matches more often than the cynics allow. Or you may be near strangers, two well-bred people who share a name and a dynasty, and a dinner table, and very little else, unfailingly polite, fundamentally apart. What you almost certainly are not, by the standard of a later age, is partners in the full modern sense, confiding everything, sharing the daily texture of a life. The world you were both born into did not build marriage for that. It built marriage to join estates, to continue bloodlines, to consolidate power, and it kept husband and wife in their separate kingdoms precisely so that each could perform a separate function without the messy interference of too much intimacy. And so you may dine across 40 feet of mahogany from a man you have been married to for 20 years and realize, with a small cool start, that you do not entirely know him, and that he has never once, in all that time, asked himself whether he knows you. And here we arrive at the secret sickness of your whole gilded existence, the thing the India shop girl could never guess, and would never believe if you told her, that the most envied life in England is, very often, crushingly, soul-deadeningly boring. Think of what your days actually contain, stripped of their finery. You may not work. To earn money would disgrace your husband and your name. You may not pursue a profession, attend a university, hold an office, or trouble yourself with anything resembling a serious occupation, for all of these are closed to a woman of your rank by iron custom. You have servants to do every practical thing, so you may not even fill your hours with the honest labor of running your own home. What, then, is left to fill the long, long stretch of an aristocratic day? Calls of 15 minutes. Letters. A slow drive in a circle to be looked at. Needlework. The piano. A little watercolor painting. The reading of a novel, if it is not too clever, for a clever woman makes everyone uneasy. The arranging of flowers. The endless management of a social life, that is, when you examine it honestly, an elaborate machine for consuming time that has nowhere else to go. This is why young ladies of your class are trained, from the schoolroom, in what were frankly called accomplishments, the piano and the harp, a little French and Italian, drawing, dancing, fine embroidery, the singing of pretty songs. These were not skills in any useful sense. They were, quite explicitly, ways of being decoratively occupied, ways of filling the vast empty hours of a life with no permitted purpose, gracefully, so that a lady might never be caught doing nothing and never be tempted toward doing anything that mattered. And for a woman of ordinary appetites, perhaps it sufficed. But for a woman of real intelligence, real energy, real ambition, and there were a great many of those, for nature distributes brilliance without the slightest regard for what society will permit a person to do with it, the boredom could become a kind of slow agony, a lifetime of a fine mind pacing a cage with nothing to push against. And that is precisely why the women in tonight's stories did the dangerous, dramatic, self-destructive, magnificent things they did. Georgiana gambled away fortunes at the card table partly because the card table was one of the few arenas in which a woman of her world was allowed to feel the electric thrill of risk and consequence. She flung herself into politics because politics was real, and almost nothing else in her gilded life was. Sisi drove her body through punishing regimes of riding and fencing and starvation partly because her body was the one kingdom in which her will could actually do something, could set a goal and achieve it, in a life where every other lever of action had been taken from her hands. The hunger to matter, denied every honest outlet, comes out sideways, in scandal, in obsession, in recklessness, in the desperate manufacture of drama, in a life too cushioned to contain any real stakes. A great deal of what looks, from the outside, like the wickedness or the madness of these famous women is, looked at more closely, simply the thrashing of caged intelligence with absolutely nothing useful to do. You hold that same restless mind behind your serene Duchess's smile. And you, too, must find some way to live with it, in the long bright boredom of having everything and being permitted to do nothing. And then, the afternoon. The hours after luncheon are when the Duchess at last leaves her gilded box and goes out into the world to be looked at, which is, you will come to understand, one of the central occupations of your life. You exist, in large part, to be seen. To be seen in the correct gown, in the correct carriage, in the correct company, at the correct hour, in the correct place. Your visibility is a form of work, and you perform it daily with the discipline of an actress who never gets a night off. So you go for a drive. Not because you have anywhere to be, you almost never have anywhere to be, but because being driven slowly through the park in an open carriage at the fashionable hour is how you announce, without a single word, that you exist, that you are well, that you are in town, and that you are exactly as magnificent as everyone remembers. In London during the season, this means Hyde Park, and a particular stretch of it where, between 5 and 7 in the evening, the entire glittering upper crust of the nation rolls slowly back and forth in their carriages, bowing and nodding and pretending not to stare, in a procession so dense and so pointless, and so socially essential that it functions as the beating heart of fashionable life. You sit very upright. The corset insists, beneath a parasol, in a bonnet that took a milliner 3 days, and a small fortune to construct, and you incline your head, just so, to the right people, and you withhold that same gracious nod from the wrong ones, and every tiny gesture is noted, parsed, and discussed at 100 dinner tables that night. A duchess who bows to a rising young hostess can make her. A duchess who looks straight through an old friend can ruin her. You hold this power not because you are clever or cruel, but simply because of who you married, and you wield it half-consciously, the way you breathe, because you have never known a world in which a glance from you did not rearrange the room. It is, when you stop to think about it, which you rarely do, because thinking about it too hard is not encouraged, a very strange way to spend an afternoon. You are a grown woman of considerable intelligence, riding in a circle, very slowly, in order to be admired. And tomorrow you will do it again. And the day after that. The carriage rolls on beneath the plane trees, the light turns golden, and somewhere a young woman on the railing watches you pass and thinks, with her whole aching heart, that she would give anything to trade places with you. She has no idea. She has absolutely no idea. But the drive is only the prelude. Because the true arena of an aristocratic afternoon, the place where reputations are quietly made and unmade over porcelain cups, is the ritual that the English perfected and gave to the world, and that you, as a duchess, perform with the precision of a duelist. It is time for afternoon tea. And afternoon tea, my dear, is where the real fighting is done. Tea, as a social institution, is relatively new in your lifetime, credited, by legend, to a duchess much like yourself, the Duchess of Bedford, who is said to have suffered from a sinking feeling in the long gap between luncheon and a fashionably late dinner, and who began ordering tea and a little something sent to her room in the afternoon, until the habit spread and became an empire of its own. So in a sense, the ritual you are about to perform was invented by a bored aristocrat who was simply hungry. This is, if you think about it, the origin story of a remarkable amount of upper-class culture. A bored, hungry, very rich woman deciding that the thing she wanted to do should henceforth be a tradition. The tea things are brought in. The silver pot, the delicate cups so thin you could almost see the tea through them, the tiered stand of bread and butter sliced impossibly fine, the little cakes, the cucumber sandwiches with their crusts amputated. And you pour. The pouring of tea is, itself, a small performance of rank. In your own drawing-room you pour, because to be the one who pours is to be the mistress, the sinner, the hostess, and you would no more let a guest pour your tea than a general would let a private give the orders. You ask each lady how she takes it, though you have known most of them for 20 years, and could recite their preferences in your sleep, because the asking is part of the courtesy, the gentle theater of hospitality that smooths every aristocratic interaction. And then, beneath the murmured pleasantries and the clink of porcelain, the real business begins. Because tea is where the women talk, and the women, who are barred from the vote, from the professions, from the universities, from almost every formal lever of power in the kingdom, have built themselves an informal empire of information, and its capital is the tea table. Here, in the soft afternoon light, you learn things. You learn which marriage is in trouble. You learn which fortune has quietly evaporated behind a still grand facade. You learn which young lady was seen walking too long in the shrubbery with which young man, and what her mother is frantically doing about it. You learn who is dying, who is expecting, who is ruined, who is rising. And you trade. A morsel of news for a morsel of news, a confidence for a confidence, all of it wrapped in such gentle, smiling, indirect language that an eavesdropping man would hear nothing but pleasant nothings, and never suspect that he had just witnessed the redistribution of an entire community's reputations. This is your real power, far more than the carriage or the jewels. You are a node in a vast network of information that the men, for all their seats in Parliament and their clubs and their command of armies, simply cannot access, because no one tells a man the things that are told to a woman over tea. You know who can be trusted and who cannot. You know which alliance to encourage and which to quietly strangle. You arrange marriages with a raised eyebrow. You end them with a sigh. And you do it all so softly, so deniably, that it never once looks like power at all. That is the genius the world has trained you in. They took away every official kind of authority a woman might hold, and in exchange you learned to rule from behind a teacup, invisibly and rather well. But a duchess's life is far larger than a single drawing-room, and before the candles are lit for dinner, there are whole provinces of it we have not yet walked through. So let us wander, gently, through a few of them, the way the mind wanders just before sleep, and let us begin in the highest, quietest room in the house, the one you visit least and love most, the nursery. Somewhere far above you, up a separate staircase, in a wing kept deliberately apart from the noise and ceremony of the great rooms, your children are being raised by other women. This is the great, strange grief at the center of an aristocratic mother's life, and you carry it so quietly that even you sometimes forget it is there. Your babies are handed almost at birth to a wet nurse, and then to a nanny, and then to a nursery maid, and then, as they grow, to a governess for the girls, and a tutor, and a distant school for the boys. They live their small lives in the nursery and the schoolroom, on a schedule that has almost nothing to do with yours. You see them, most days, for a carefully arranged hour, the children's hour, when they are scrubbed and combed and dressed in their best and brought down to the drawing-room to be presented to their parents, like charming little ambassadors from a foreign country, before being taken back upstairs to their real lives, which are conducted entirely without you. You love them. Make no mistake about that. The notion that aristocratic mothers were cold to their children is mostly a slander invented by people who have never read the desperate, tender letters such mothers actually wrote. You love your children with a fierceness that would frighten them if they knew. But you love them across a distance built into the very architecture of your house and the very customs of your class. And the result is that you know your housekeeper's daily routine far better than you know your own son's, and that one day, when that son is grown, he will speak more fondly of his nanny than of you, and you will smile, and say nothing, and feel the small cold draught of it pass through you like wine through an old corridor. And then there is the question of where you are, because a duchess does not have a home so much as a circuit, a great wheeling orbit through the calendar that the entire aristocracy performs together, year after year, like migrating birds and jewels. There is the London season, roughly the spring and early summer, when Parliament sits and the whole fashionable world crowds into town for the balls and the parties and the marriage market, when your town house is thrown open, and your days fill with the breathless social warfare we have already glimpsed. Then, as the summer heat rises and London empties, everyone flees to the country. There is the autumn, with its shooting parties, when the great houses fill with gentlemen blasting away at pheasants, and the ladies organize the elaborate house parties that surround the sport. There is Christmas at the ancestral seat, with its tenantry and its traditions. There is the slow, quiet, muddy depth of winter in the country, and then the whole great wheel turns again, and it is time to open the town house and return to the season. You do not pack for these moves the way an ordinary person packs. When the Duchess relocates, an entire household relocates with her. Servants, linens, plate, sometimes whole rooms of furniture, transported in a small army of carriages and, increasingly, by the marvelous new railways, in a logistical operation that would shame a general. You travel with your lady's maid, your jewels, your favorite things, and the comfortable assumption that wherever you arrive, another version of your perfect life will already have been arranged and waiting, because a phalanx of servants will have gone ahead to light the fires and air the beds and lay the tables, so that you may step from one gilded existence into another without ever once feeling the join. And at the heart of the country half of that life is the estate, not just the great house, but the land, the farms, the village, the hundreds of people whose lives are bound up with your families the way they have been for centuries. And here you have a role that is genuine and old, and not entirely without meaning. You are the Lady Bountiful. You visit the cottages of the tenants and the laborers. You bring baskets to the sick and the newly delivered mothers, calf's foot jelly and beef tea and warm flannel, the medicine of the well-meaning rich. You take an interest in the village school, perhaps, and the church, and the deserving poor, dispensing charity and concern with a graciousness that is half genuine kindness and half the quiet maintenance of a very old bargain. The people of the estate owe your family their deference, and your family owes them, in return, a certain care. It is paternalism, of course, a relationship of vast and unquestioned inequality, in which a sick child's life may depend on whether the Duchess happens to be feeling generous that week. But it is also, on a human level, real. You hold the hand of a dying old woman who has lived her whole life in the shadow of your house. You stand as godmother to children whose fathers plow your fields. And in your better moments you understand that the comfort you float through every day is built, quite directly, on their labor, though you do not let that thought linger long, because it is not a restful one, and you have a dinner to dress for. But before we return to the candlelight, let us be honest about one more thing, because it sits underneath every gown you have worn tonight, the staggering, almost unbelievable cost of being you. The clothes alone are a fortune renewed and renewed again. A great lady might require a different gown for every part of every day, a morning dress, a walking dress, a carriage dress, a visiting dress, a tea gown, a dinner gown, a ball gown, and she would no more wear the same evening gown twice in the same season before the same people than she would arrive at dinner barefoot. Your modiste, your dressmaker, is an artist and an institution, and her bills are colossal, and they are paid, eventually, often very late, because the aristocracy were famously, almost proudly slow to settle accounts with the tradespeople who served them. There are gowns, and the riding habits, and the furs, and the bonnets, and the gloves, and the boots, and the parasols, and the fans, and the endless small expensive nothings, and there are the jewels, which are a separate empire entirely, much of it belonging not to you but to the family, heirlooms held in trust, fastened around your neck for an evening and locked away again, beautiful and not quite yours. You move through the world wrapped in more money than most families will see in 10 lifetimes, and you think about it exactly as much as you think about the air, which is to say, only when something goes wrong. And finally, lying beneath all of it, there is the matter of your body and its health, in an age that understood the female body chiefly as a mystery to be managed and a problem to be hushed. You will be attended by doctors, men, always men, who approach your ailments through a thick fog of theory, prudishness, and frank ignorance. A great deal of what troubles a woman in this century is filed under the vast, convenient heading of nerves, and the prescribed cure is very often rest, retreat, and the firm advice to stop thinking so much, which is administered to clever, stifled women with particular enthusiasm. You may be told to take to your bed for weeks. You may be sent to take the waters at a spa, to bathe in and drink from mineral springs in the company of other genteel invalids. You will bear your children, as we have said, in real danger and real pain, attended by those same doctors, and you will lose some of them, almost certainly, to the illnesses that no amount of money could yet defeat, for a duchess's child died of scarlet fever and diphtheria as readily as a laborer's, and the grandest nursery in England could not keep death from climbing its separate stair. Your magnificent life does not exempt your body from the century. It only dresses the century's cruelties in better clothes. There are, too, the great set pieces of the year, the towering ceremonial occasions around which the whole season is built, and at which a duchess must shine brightest of all. Chief among them is presentation at court. The moment a young lady, or a newly married one, is formally presented to the Queen, and so admitted into society in the fullest and most official sense. It is an ordeal dressed as an honor. The required costume is laid down by ancient rule and is gloriously impractical. A gown with a long train measured to the inch, a headdress of ostrich feathers, a veil, and long white gloves, the whole ensemble costing a fortune and serving no purpose but this single bow. You wait for hours in a long line of carriages inching toward the palace, packed in your finery, unable to sit comfortably, unable to eat, while crowds gather on the pavements to gawp at the procession of the great. And then, at last, your name is announced, and you enter the presence, and you perform the deep, sweeping court curtsy, sinking almost to the floor and rising again without wobble, without stumble, without the slightest loss of dignity, in a gown weighed down by a 6-foot train, having practiced the movement for weeks under the eye of a specialist who teaches nothing else. You kiss the Queen's hand, or she inclines her head, and it is over in seconds, seconds that cost weeks of preparation and a small fortune and a great deal of nerve. And then you must back out of the royal presence, never turning your back upon the sovereign, managing that fearsome train behind you with a practiced kick, retreating gracefully into the crowd. You have arrived. You are now officially somebody, and your feet are killing you. Then there are the balls, not the modest dances of a country gathering, but the vast set-piece balls of the London season, where 500 guests crowd into a great house lit by thousands of candles or, increasingly, by the dazzling new gas and electric light, where the supper alone could feed a regiment, where the flowers are stripped from a dozen hothouses, and where you dance, and stand, and converse, and preside until 3 or 4 in the morning before climbing into your carriage in the gray dawn light with your feet ruined, and your smile still bolted firmly in place. There is the opera, where the boxes matter far more than the music, and where being seen in the right box on the right night is its own small campaign. There is Royal Ascot in June, the great racing festival, where the aristocracy migrates to the course to watch the horses and, far more importantly, to watch one another, the fashion studied and judged as fiercely as the form of the runners. The season is not a holiday. It is a campaign season, a month-long marathon of obligatory pleasure, and you run it at a sprint, in a corset, every single year, until you are too old or too tired or too grand to need to run it any longer. And then, as summer fades, the whole glittering machine packs up and migrates to the country, and the year turns to its other great social ritual, the house party. When the shooting season opens, the great houses fill with guests, who come to stay not for an evening, but for days, or even weeks, and the Duchess becomes the general of a campaign of hospitality that would daunt a hotelier. Bedrooms must be assigned, and the assigning of bedrooms is itself a delicate art, freighted with meaning, for who is placed near whom, and in which wing, says a great deal that is never spoken aloud. The men go out by day, with the gamekeepers, and their guns, and slaughter pheasants by the hundred and thousand, a strange and bloody pageant of which the ladies see little beyond the elaborate luncheons carried out to them in the field. The ladies fill the daylight hours with walks and needlework and letters, and the endless soft warfare of conversation. And the evenings are given over to grand dinners and music and cards and dancing, night after night, with the Duchess orchestrating all of it, the menus, the placements, the entertainments, the small crises of 40 house guests and the servants who attend them, for as long as the party lasts. It is, when you tally it honestly, a colossal feat of management, performed by a woman who is permitted to take no visible credit for it, because the highest art of the hostess is to make the whole vast effort appear to have happened by itself, like weather. And looming over all of it, never far from the surface in this century so intimate with death, is mourning, for the Victorians built around grief an entire architecture of ritual as elaborate as anything in the ballroom. When a relative dies, you go into mourning, and mourning has rules as strict as any precedents at dinner. There is deep mourning, in dull black crape that may not catch the light, worn for a prescribed period that depends precisely on your relationship to the dead. There is the slow, regulated easing through half-mourning, the grays, and the mauves, and the soft purples permitted once the first heavy season of black has passed. There are mourning jewels, jet and woven hair set in lockets, and black-edged writing paper, and the withdrawal from society for a measured span. A widow mourned longest and most severely of all, swathed in black for years, her grief made visible and public and obligatory, for the Queen herself, after losing her beloved Albert, retreated into a mourning so deep and so prolonged that it lasted the rest of her very long life, and set the tone for a whole nation's relationship with death. And mourning points toward your own final chapter, the one that waits at the end of every duchess's road. For if you outlive your husband, and you may well, for women often did, your world transforms in an instant. You cease to be the Duchess. You become the Dowager Duchess, and the title, the house, the position, the precedence, all of it passes at once to your son's wife, the new young Duchess, who steps into the place you have held for 30 years while you step back, and aside, and away. You may move to a smaller house on the estate, the dower house, kept for exactly this purpose. You go from being the center of the great machine to being an honored, slightly antique fixture on its edge, consulted, perhaps, respected, certainly, but no longer the sun around which the household turns. It is the last lesson the gilded cage teaches you, that even your supreme position was never truly yours, only lent, held in trust, like the jewels, to be handed on to the next woman the moment the man who gave it to you is gone. You are the Duchess. And then, with a single death, you are simply the woman who used to be. So that is the fuller shape of it. The children love from a distance, the great wheel of the year, the tenants and the charity and the cost and the fragile mortal body beneath the silk, the towering ceremonies and the endless hospitality, and the long black road of mourning that waits at the end. It is a life of almost incomprehensible privilege, and it is also a life hemmed in on every side by duty, by custom, by the relentless performance of being who you are. And now, having wandered through these quiet provinces of it, we return to where we left you, to the drawing-room, to the dying afternoon, to the small ordinary fact that pulls you back into the day's last act. The cups are cleared. The light begins to fail. And now the day performs its strangest trick of all. it asks you to get dressed again. Because everything you suffered through this morning, the lacing and the padding and the buttoning and the building, all of it is now to be undone and done over, in grander form, for the evening. You return upstairs to Dawson and to the long glass, and the whole architecture comes off, and the new and more magnificent architecture goes on, because the gown you wore to be looked at in the park is emphatically not the gown you may wear to dinner, and to appear at your own table in afternoon dress would be a confession of either poverty or madness. So you are unlaced and relaced, the corset cinched perhaps a touch tighter for the evening silhouette. The day gown is exchanged for an evening gown, lower at the neck and shoulders, because the rules of Victorian modesty are a strange and shifting map, and an amount of bosom and shoulder that would be scandalous at noon becomes perfectly correct after dark, when the candles are lit and the jewels come out. And the jewels do come out. The great pieces, the diamonds and emeralds that live most of their lives in a locked safe or at the bank, are brought forth and fastened around your throat and wrists, and woven into your rebuilt hair, until you glitter in the candlelight like a window in a very expensive shop. And here is a small, sharp truth hidden among all that fire and light. Most of these jewels are not yours. They are the family's. They are heirlooms, the parure of diamonds and the rope of pearls, and the great historic stones that have been worn by the duchesses of this house for generations, and will be worn by the duchesses who come after you, held in trust, fastened around your neck for an evening and locked away again, beautiful and borrowed and bound for someone else's throat the moment your reign as duchess ends. You are their keeper, not their owner. You are, in a sense, only the latest woman to be allowed to glitter in them for a while. And the same is quietly true of nearly everything around you. The house is entailed, passing intact to the male heir. The land is the dukedom's. The very title that makes you who you are is your husband's, lent to you by marriage and revocable, in effect, by widowhood. Run your eye around your magnificent life, and try to find the thing that is yours, truly and only yours, that no settlement or entail or death could take from you, and you will find the list is heartbreakingly short. Your letters, perhaps. Your friendships. The love of your children, if you can reach across the nursery stairs to claim it. The diamonds at your throat are worth a fortune, and they are not yours. The affection in a child's eyes is worth nothing on the market, and it is the realest thing you own. It takes most women a lifetime in the gilded cage to learn which of those two is the treasure. Some of them, as we shall see, never quite did. Some learned it only at the very end, and some, the lucky few, learned it in time to build a different life on it. Dawson works swiftly, for there is less time now. The gong will sound soon, and a duchess is never, ever late to her own dinner, because the entire household has been arranging itself for hours around the precise moment you will descend the stairs. And descend you do. The grand staircase of a great house is not merely a way of getting from one floor to another. It is a stage, and you are its leading lady, and your descent into the hall where your guests are gathered for dinner is one of the great daily performances of your life. You come down slowly, one gloved hand resting on the banister, your gown sweeping behind you, your jewels catching the light, and below you the assembled company turns and looks up, and for one suspended moment the entire purpose of all that morning's labor, the cold bath, the brutal corset, the hour of hairpins, the second dressing, is made manifest. This is what it was all for. You are not getting dressed. You are being forged. And here, at the top of the stairs, the Duchess steps fully into being. Dinner is announced. And dinner, you will find, is the most beautiful and the most exhausting battle of your entire day. It begins, before a single morsel is eaten, with a problem of mathematics and diplomacy combined, the question of precedence. Everyone at your table must be ranked, precisely, by their place in the great frozen order of British society, and they must go into dinner in that exact order, each gentleman escorting the lady appropriate to his rank, arm in arm, in a slow procession from drawing-room to dining-room. Get it wrong, seat a baron above an earl, send in a mere knight's wife ahead of the daughter of a marquis, and you have committed a blunder that will be discussed, with relish, for weeks. There are books published on this. There are tables of precedents consulted as gravely as Scripture. And as hostess, it falls to you to solve this lethal little puzzle every time you entertain, arranging your guests like a chess problem in which every piece is touchy about its value. You go in on the arm of the most senior gentleman present, and you take your place at one end of a table, so long that conversing with the far end would require either shouting or a telegraph. And then the meal begins, and it is not a meal so much as an expedition, conducted in courses that march on, and on, and on, for 2 hours or more. Soup, then fish, then the entrees, then the great roasts, then game, then sweets, then a savory, then fruit and ices, each course with its own wines, each plate whisked away and replaced by silent, white-gloved footmen who have been drilled to move like ghosts. There may be 8 courses. There may be 12. You will taste a little of each and finish almost none, partly from manners and partly because, somewhere around the fish, your corset filed a formal complaint with your stomach, and the two of them stopped speaking to each other. And all the while you are working. Because the duty of the hostess at dinner is conversation, and it is governed by a rule so rigid and so peculiar that it deserves its own monument, the rule of turning the table. You must converse with the gentleman on one side of you, say, the one who took you in, through the first courses. And then, at a certain point, signaled by the hostess herself, the entire table turns, and everyone pivots, as one, to speak to the partner on their other side. To the casual observer it looks like the gentle ebb and flow of dinner chat. It is, in fact, a synchronized maneuver of almost military precision, and woe betide the guest who is caught talking to the wrong neighbor at the wrong moment, stranded mid-sentence, as the whole table swings away from him like a flock of starlings. You set the rhythm. You are the metronome of the meal, and you keep up a stream of charming, intelligent, perfectly witless conversation for 2 solid hours, on no subject of any importance whatsoever, while wearing a garment that is slowly relocating your internal organs. It is a performance. It is athletic. And you make it look like rest. At last the sweets are cleared, and the moment arrives for the most quietly loaded ritual of the evening. You catch the eye of the senior lady, you gather yourself, and you rise, and at your signal, every woman at the table rises with you, and the ladies withdraw, sweeping out of the dining room in a rustle of silk and leaving the gentlemen alone with the port, the cigars, and the conversation they cannot have in front of you. This is the famous separation of the sexes after dinner, and it is presented as a delicate courtesy, the ladies retiring to let the men enjoy their coarser pleasures. But you understand its real meaning perfectly well. You are being removed. There are things men say to one another over the port, about money, about politics, about the world, that you are not meant to hear, and so, with exquisite politeness, you are escorted out of the room where the world is discussed and into the drawing-room, where the women wait. And in that drawing-room, while the men laugh somewhere behind a closed door, the women resume the other business of the evening, The same soft, ceaseless trading of information that ran beneath the tea table, now conducted in the candlelit hush after dinner. You preside. You pour the coffee. You guide the conversation. You soothe the nervous young wife. You flatter the dowager whose goodwill you need, and you keep one ear, always, tuned to the door, because when the gentlemen rejoin you the evening's tone will shift again, and you must be ready to orchestrate the next movement of the symphony. Perhaps there will be music. Your accomplished cousin coaxed to the piano, a young lady persuaded to sing, her voice thin and sweet over the candle's smoke. Perhaps cards. Perhaps, if the company is large enough and the night young enough, the carpets will be rolled back and there will be dancing. For if it is the height of the season, and you are in town, then a great many of your evenings will not end in your own quiet drawing-room at all, but will spill outward into the vast, glittering, exhausting machine of the social calendar, the balls. And a Victorian ball is not a party. It is a marketplace dressed up as a fairy tale. Beneath the chandeliers, and the music, and the banks of forced flowers, the real transaction is marriage, daughters displayed, suitors assessed, fortunes and titles weighed against one another by watchful mothers stationed around the walls, like generals surveying a battlefield. As a duchess, you sail through it all as a kind of admiral of the fleet, your favor sought, your invitations coveted. You're not able to launch a debutante or sinker. You will dance, a little, with the correct partners. You will stand up the length of a ballroom in a corset and slippers until 2 or 3 in the morning. And you will smile the entire time, because the smile, by now, is not an expression. It is a uniform. You put it on, with a gown, and you do not take it off until the carriage door closes and the horses turn for home. And then, at last, in the small cold hours, the Duchess goes back up the great staircase. But the day is not quite finished with you, because there is one more part of your life that no one speaks of, and that the carriages and the diamonds and the curtsies exist, in the end, to serve. There is the matter of the bedroom, and the air, and the very particular loneliness that waits for you at the top of the house. You return to Dawson, half asleep on her feet but waiting, always waiting, and the long unbuilding begins. The jewels come off and go back into their cases. The hair comes down, pin by pin, until the great structure collapses and your hair falls loose past your waist again, the way no one but Dawson ever sees it. The gown is unfastened, the corset unlaced at last, and you feel the day's grip on your ribs finally release. That strange, swimming sensation of a body remembering its own shape. You are wiped down, wrapped in a nightgown, and at last, blessedly left alone. The fire is banked low. The candle is snuffed, and the Duchess lies down in her vast curtained bed in a vast cold house, the most envied woman for 40 miles, and stares up into the dark. Here is the thing the penny novels never tell the shop girl dreaming of your life. Your marriage was very probably not, at its root, about love. It was a treaty. 2 great families, 2 fortunes, 2 bloodlines, joined by lawyers and settled by contract, with you and your husband as the signatures at the bottom. Perhaps affection grew. It often did. People are people, and many of these arranged unions ripened into genuine fondness, even devotion. But many did not. And whether love came or not, your central, inescapable duty as a duchess was never companionship. It was continuity. You were married to produce an heir, a son, specifically, to carry the title and the estates intact into the next generation, because the whole towering edifice of your husband's house rests on the existence of a boy who does not yet exist, and it is your body that is expected to supply him. So you will bear children, very probably a great many of them, in an age with no reliable relief from the pain and real danger of it, attended by doctors who wash their hands rather less often than you might hope. You will hand your babies, almost at once, to a wet nurse, and then a nanny, and then a governess, and then, for your sons, to a school far away, so that you see your own children for carefully scheduled portions of the day, brought down clean and brushed to the drawing room for an hour before being whisked back up to the nursery wing you rarely visit. You will love them, fiercely, from a distance the modern heart can barely imagine. And you will know, always, that your value in this house was sealed the moment you produced the heir, and that everything before that was suspense. And your husband, the Duke, lives, in many ways, a separate life. He has his estates, his politics, his clubs in town, his shooting in the autumn, his own great wing of the house, his own valet, his own world that runs parallel to yours and intersects it at dinner and on formal occasions. You may be partners, allies, fond friends. You may be near strangers who are unfailingly polite. But you are rarely, in the modern sense, companions, because the whole architecture of your class was built to keep men and women in separate spheres, and the bedroom of a great house can be one of the loneliest rooms in England. So you lie there, in the dark, at the top of your beautiful gilded cage. You wanted for nothing, and you chose almost nothing. You commanded 50 servants, and could not unlace your own dress. You held the power to make and break reputations with a glance, and you held no power at all over the shape of your own days, which were decided for you, generations before your birth, by customs so old it felt like law. You were rich. You were envied. You were, very often, profoundly alone. And tomorrow, when the housemaid creeps in before dawn to build your fire, it will all begin again, exactly the same, because that is what it is to be a duchess, a life of unimaginable luxury, lived inside walls you did not build and cannot leave, with a smile you are never quite allowed to put down. That is the truth of it. That is what they never tell you. The cage is real, even when it is made of gold, perhaps especially when it is made of gold, because a gold cage is the one no one will ever let you complain about. And so you close your eyes, in your warm velvet dark, and you let the great house creak and settle around you, and you drift toward sleep, the way we all do, rich and poor alike, in the end. But you were not the only woman to live this life, and some of them did not bear it quietly. Some of them, given this same gilded cage, did the most dangerous thing a woman of their world could do. They became unforgettable. So before you fully drift away tonight, let me tell you about 3 of them. Real women. Real duchesses, empresses, and heiresses, who were handed this exact life of beauty and confinement, and who each, in her own way, refused to disappear into it. The first was the most dazzling, the most scandalous, the most beloved woman in all of Georgian England, a duchess who gambled fortunes, swayed elections, and broke every rule there was, all while trapped in a marriage stranger than any novel. Her name was Georgiana. Long before she was the Duchess of Devonshire, the most famous woman in England, she was simply Georgiana Spencer, a bright, warm, impulsive girl born in 1757 into one of the grandest families in the country, an ancestor, as it happens, of a princess the whole world would mourn more than 2 centuries later. Georgiana was clever and charming and desperate, always, to be loved, and she grew up in a world of immense privilege and immense expectation. And at the age of just 16, barely more than a child, she was married to William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire, one of the richest and most powerful men in the kingdom, and one of the coldest. The marriage was, on paper, a triumph. She was a duchess before she was 17, mistress of Chatsworth and Devonshire House, mother-to-be of a dynasty. But the Duke was reserved to the point of Frost, a man who reportedly found conversation a chore and emotion an embarrassment, and who was far more attached to his dogs than he ever appeared to be to his luminous young wife. Georgiana, who wanted nothing in the world so much as to be adored, had married a man almost constitutionally incapable of adoring her. And so she went looking for the love she could not find at home in the one place that would give it to her without limit. She went looking for it in the public. And the public gave it to her, completely. For Georgiana had a gift that no title can confer, and no fortune can buy. She was magnetic. She walked into a room, and the room rearranged itself around her. She was not, by the strict accounts of the day, the most beautiful woman of her age, but she was something rarer and more powerful. She was the most charming, the most alive, the most watched. And she became, almost overnight, the first true celebrity of the modern kind. Whatever Georgiana wore, the nation wore a week later. When she put towering plumes of ostrich feathers in her already towering hair, every fashionable woman in London sprouted feathers, until the milliners could barely keep up, and satirists drew ladies whose headdresses brushed the chandeliers. She popularized fabrics, hairstyles, mannerisms, a way of speaking. She was, in the language of a later century, a brand, and an entire industry of caricaturing gossip and printed image grew up around her face, the first flickering of the celebrity machine that we still live inside today. But Georgiana was not content to be merely decorative, and this is where she became truly dangerous. She had a fierce, restless intelligence, and she poured it into politics, into the cause of the Whigs, and above all into her devoted, possibly more than devoted friendship with the charismatic Whig leader Charles James Fox. In the great election of 1784, the Duchess of Devonshire did something almost unthinkable for a woman of her rank. She went down into the streets of Westminster and campaigned. She canvassed for votes in person, in the rough and tumble of an 18th-century election, sweeping into taverns and market stalls in her finery to charm tradesmen and laborers into supporting her party. The opposition press howled. The cartoons were merciless and often obscene. There was a famous, probably exaggerated story that she traded kisses to butchers for their votes, a tale her enemies repeated with glee to paint her as shameless, a duchess debasing herself in the gutter. But the seats were won, and Georgiana had proven something the men of her world found genuinely alarming, that a woman, barred from voting, barred from office, could still reach into the machinery of power and move it, simply by being impossible to ignore. And yet, behind the dazzle, Georgiana was coming apart. She had a secret, and it was eating her alive, and its name was the gaming table. Georgiana gambled, recklessly, compulsively, catastrophically. The card games of the aristocracy were not gentle amusements. Fortunes changed hands in a night, and Georgiana lost, and lost, and lost, and then borrowed, and lost what she had borrowed, in a spiral of debt so vast, and so secret that she hid it for years from her husband, from her family, from everyone, accumulating obligations that would equal millions in today's money. She lived in terror of discovery, writing desperate letters, juggling creditors, pawning her future against the hope of a single winning hand that never came. The most envied woman in England spent her nights sick with a financial dread that would be familiar to any gambler in any century, and she could tell no one, because a duchess does not have problems with money. A duchess is money. The mask never slipped, not in public, but underneath it she was drowning. And then there was the strange, sad, extraordinary arrangement at the heart of her home. Into Georgiana's marriage came a woman named Lady Elizabeth Foster, Bess, who became Georgiana's intimate friend and constant companion, and also, in time, the Duke's mistress. The three of them lived together, traveled together, raised a tangle of legitimate and illegitimate children together, in a household arrangement that scandalized and fascinated the entire country. Historians still argue about what exactly it all was: a betrayal, a genuine three-way devotion, a trap Georgiana could not escape, or some impossible mixture of all three. What is clear is that Georgiana loved Bess, and that Bess and the Duke produced children, and that Georgiana, the woman the whole nation watched, lived inside a domestic situation so tangled that no one, then or now, has fully been able to map it. Georgiana, too, found love at last, a real, passionate love, with the young politician Charles Grey, the future Earl Grey, the man whose name would one day be on a famous blend of tea. She became pregnant with this child. And here the iron limits of her gilded world closed around her without mercy. The Duke gave her a brutal choice: give up the child and the man, or be cast out, separated from her own legitimate children forever. There was no version of this in which Georgiana kept everything. She was sent abroad, into a kind of exile, where she bore her daughter by Grey in secret, and then surrendered the baby to be raised by Grey's family, who passed the child off as a younger sister. Georgiana would see that daughter only occasionally, as a family friend, for the rest of her life, a private grief she carried beneath the public dazzle until the day she died. She was allowed, eventually, to return. She resumed her place, her parties, her politics, her position as the brightest star in the sky. But her health was failing, worn down by the years of strain, the gambling, the childbearing, the secrets. She died in 1806, at just 48, and the outpouring of public grief was extraordinary. Crowds in the streets, the nation in mourning for a duchess who had been, for 30 years, its most beloved and most scandalous obsession. The cold Duke, who had spent a lifetime seeming barely to notice her, is said to have remarked, in the end, that she had been the best-tempered woman in England. It may be the saddest compliment ever paid by a husband, an entire marriage of withheld feeling, confessed too late to a woman who could no longer hear it. Through all of it, the one constant in Georgiana's life was her mother. Lady Spencer had raised her daughter with enormous love and enormous expectation in equal measure, and the two women wrote to each other constantly across the whole of Georgiana's life, hundreds upon hundreds of letters, in which the mother counseled, scolded, worried, and adored, and the daughter confessed, charmed, evaded, and clung. It is in those letters that the real Georgiana survives, not the painted celebrity of the print shops, but a warm, anxious, funny, frightened woman, desperate for approval, terrified of her debts, aching over her children, trying and so often failing to be the perfect daughter her mother wanted and the perfect duchess her world demanded. She was, by every account of those who actually knew her, genuinely kind, generous to a fault, quick to forgive, beloved by her servants and her friends and the crowds alike, a woman whose great sin was simply that she felt too much and wanted too much to be loved. The same hunger that drove her to the card tables and the cheering crowds was, underneath, just the hunger of a girl married at 16 to a man who would not warm to her, looking everywhere, all her life, for the affection she could not find at home. And history, which forgot her for the better part of 2 centuries, has lately remembered her again, her story retold in biography and film, her face once more before the public, her uncanny resemblance to a certain descendant of hers, a princess of a later age, who would also be the most photographed woman in the world, also trapped in a glittering loveless marriage, also adored by millions, and lonely at the very center of it all, noted by everyone who looked. The parallel is almost too neat to be borne. 2 women of the same blood, 2 centuries apart, each handed the most envied position in the land, each devoured by the public that loved them, each searching all their short lives for a tenderness their gilded marriages would not give. Georgiana would have understood her descendant perfectly. She had lived the same story first. And there was so much more to her than the dazzle and the scandal, which is the part that makes her story ache. Georgiana was genuinely, restlessly intelligent in an age that gave clever women almost nothing to do with their cleverness. She wrote poetry, and even a novel, published anonymously, a fashionable little tale that everyone in society read, while pretending not to know who had written it. She had a real and serious interest in science, in chemistry and mineralogy, corresponding with learned men, and keeping her own collection of specimens, dabbling in experiments at a time when a duchess with a laboratory was very nearly a contradiction in terms. She turned Devonshire House, her grand London home, into the beating heart of the Whig party, a political salon where the most powerful and brilliant men of the age gathered, and where Georgiana, barred from ever holding office or casting a vote, nonetheless sat at the very center of power, shaping opinion, brokering alliances, softening quarrels, and steering the conversation of a nation from behind the tea-urn and the card table. The men made the speeches. Georgiana made the room in which the speeches mattered. And all of it was watched, recorded, and sold, because Georgiana lived at the exact moment that the modern machinery of fame was being invented, and she was its first great subject. The print shops of London churned out images of her by the thousand, flattering portraits, vicious caricatures, fashion plates copying her latest gown, satirical cartoons savaging her politics and her gambling and her tangled private life. Crowds gathered outside the windows of those shops to see the newest print of the Duchess. People who would never meet her felt they knew her, loved her, owned a piece of her. It was the birth of celebrity in the form we still live with. The public appetite for a beautiful, glamorous woman, devoured equally by those who adored her and those who longed to tear her down. Georgiana was the first to be eaten alive by that appetite, 200 years before the word celebrity would carry its modern weight, and she felt every bite, and she could never, ever escape it, because the same fame that gave her the love she craved also denied her any privacy in which to nurse her wounds. Georgiana had been handed the gilded cage at 16, the very life you have lived through tonight, the gowns, the servants, the loveless contract, the smile that is never permitted to drop. And she had taken that cage and turned it, for a brilliant and tragic span of years, into a stage. She could not vote, so she swayed elections. She could not be heard, so she made herself impossible to ignore. She could not be free, so she became, at least, unforgettable. And 2 centuries later we are still saying her name in the dark, which is, perhaps, its own kind of escape. Our second woman was born to even greater heights, and found in them an even deeper unhappiness, a girl from the woods and lakes of Bavaria who became an empress, and who was called, across all of Europe, the most beautiful woman in the world. The crown nearly destroyed her. Her name was Elizabeth, though history remembers her by the name those who loved her used. They called her Sisi. She was born in 1837 into a branch of the Bavarian royal family that was, by the standards of European royalty, almost charmingly disreputable. Her father was an eccentric duke who preferred the circus to the court, who played the zither and traveled incognito, and let his children run a little wild. And so Sisi grew up in a way almost no princess of her century did, freely. She rode horses across the Bavarian countryside, roamed the forests around the family's lakeside home, scribbled poetry, and grew into a slender, dreamy, intensely private girl who loved animals and open air and her own company, and who had not the faintest preparation for, or interest in, the machinery of a great court. She was happy. It is worth pausing on that, because it is the last time in her story the word will comfortably fit. When she was 15, her older sister Helene was taken to the resort town of Bad Ischl to be presented to their cousin, the young Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, in the expectation that he would marry her. The two mothers had arranged it all. It was meant to be Helene's day. But the young emperor took one look at 15-year-old Sisi, there only as the unimportant little sister, tagging along, and fell, instantly and completely, in love. He refused to consider Helene. He would have Sisi or no one. And so the shy, wild girl who loved the forests was, within a year, married to the most powerful monarch in Central Europe and transplanted into the most rigid, suffocating, ceremony-bound court in the world, the court of the Habsburgs in Vienna. It nearly killed her at once. The Spanish court etiquette of the Habsburgs was a thing of almost insane elaboration, a cage of protocol that dictated every gesture of every hour, and into this airless machine they dropped a 16-year-old who had grown up running barefoot by a lake. Worse, far worse, was her mother-in-law, the Archduchess Sophie, a steely, controlling woman who regarded the dreamy young empress as hopelessly unsuited to her role, and set about correcting her. Sophie controlled everything. And when Sisi began to have children, Sophie took them, too, quite literally moved the babies into apartments near her own and supervised their upbringing, allowing the young mother only limited, scheduled access to her own infants, on the grounds that Sisi was too young, too silly, too unstable to be trusted with the heirs to the empire. Imagine it. A girl barely out of childhood, homesick for the forest, married to a kind but duty-bound man who always took his mother's side, watching her babies raised by the very woman who had decided she was not fit to raise them. One of those children, a little daughter, died in early childhood while traveling, a grief that broke something in Sisi that never fully healed. And so Sisi did what trapped and powerless women of beauty have so often done. She turned her cage inward, and made her own body the one kingdom she could rule absolutely. She became, in modern terms, obsessed with her appearance, her weight, her famous hair, her control over the single thing the court could not take from her. Her hair was extraordinary, a thick chestnut mane that fell to the floor, and its care became a daily ritual that consumed hours, a special hairdresser, an elaborate washing with eggs and brandy that occupied an entire day every few weeks, a styling so heavy with pinned-up braids that Sisi complained her hair gave her headaches, and that she felt she was carrying her own crown of it. She maintained a waist that contemporaries measured at numbers that strained belief, lacing herself ferociously, sometimes sleeping in damp cloths or special wraps, training over years toward an ideal that became less about fashion and more about discipline, about command, about the one realm where her will, and only her will, was law. She ate almost nothing. She exercised with an intensity that astonished her age, installing gymnastics equipment in her palaces, hauling herself up on rings and bars, walking and riding for hours until her attendants could barely keep pace. She became one of the finest and boldest horsewomen in all of Europe, riding to hounds in England and Ireland with a recklessness that thrilled and terrified those who watched. And she traveled endlessly, restlessly, fleeing Vienna and its etiquette and its archduchess for Hungary, for the Greek islands, for the open sea, for anywhere that was not the gilded prison of the Hofburg. The Empress of Austria became a kind of beautiful ghost, glimpsed here and there across the continent, always moving, always veiled, always just leaving, a woman who possessed everything the world could offer and wanted only to be somewhere else, anywhere else, away. She guarded her famous beauty so jealously that, as she aged, she essentially withdrew it from view. She stopped allowing herself to be painted or photographed past a certain age, so that the image of the most beautiful woman in the world might remain frozen young forever. She took to carrying a fan and a leather parasol to hide her face from strangers and cameras alike. The beauty that had been her one source of power had become, in the end, another prison. She had built her entire identity on it, and so she could not bear to be seen losing it, and she vanished behind black veils to protect a legend that had quietly become heavier than any crown. The cruelest part of it all is that, at the very center of her gilded misery, there was a man who genuinely loved her, her husband, the Emperor himself. Franz Joseph adored Elizabeth with a steady, dogged, uncomprehending devotion to the end of his days, writing her tender letters, calling her by fond pet names, longing for her presence even as she fled him across the continent year after year. But he was a creature wholly made of duty, rigid, hard-working, rising before dawn to labor over the paperwork of his empire, incapable of imagining a life outside the iron schedule of his office and his protocol, and constitutionally unable to understand the wild, poetic, claustrophobic creature he had fallen in love with at a country resort when she was 15. He loved her, and he could not save her, because the very thing he could not give her was the only thing she wanted, which was release from the world he embodied. Theirs is one of history's saddest marriages, not a cruel one, not a cold one exactly, but a profound and permanent mismatch between a man who found his peace in duty, and a woman who found in duty her slow suffocation. He would outlive her, and his son, and very nearly his whole world, ruling on into terrible old age, alone with his paperwork and his grief. And as the years darkened, Sisi seemed almost to court the death that was coming for her. She spoke of it, wrote of it, longed for it in her melancholy verses. She traveled with a strange fatalism, refusing heavy guards, wandering Europe under thin disguises and assumed names, as though daring the world to find her. She had a horror of growing old, and a deepening fascination with the end, and when the end did come, on that quiet quay in Geneva, some who knew her felt that a part of her had been walking toward it for years. She had said, more than once, that she hoped to die quickly, far from the great state deathbeds of her family, away from the eyes of the court. In a terrible way, she got her wish. And then the tragedies came, one after another, and ground her down. Her cousin, the King of Bavaria, drowned in mysterious and terrible circumstances. And then, in 1889, the blow that ended whatever was left of her spirit, her only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, sensitive, troubled, the heir to the empire, died in a murder-suicide pact with his young mistress at a hunting lodge called Mayerling, a scandal so dark and so devastating that it shook the thrones of Europe. Sisi never recovered. She put on black and essentially never took it off again. The dreamy girl from the Bavarian woods, the radiant young empress, the most beautiful woman in the world, became a wandering woman in mourning, drifting from city to city, country to country, outrunning a grief that could not be outrun. Her end, when it came, was almost unbearably random. In 1898, in Geneva, traveling as she always traveled, quietly, with a single companion, trying to be no one, she was walking to catch a steamer on the lake when a young Italian anarchist, who had come to the city hoping to kill some royal, any royal, and had simply learned that an empress happened to be in town, stepped up and stabbed her once in the chest with a sharpened file. The blade was so thin, the wound so small, that Sisi at first did not realize what had happened. She rose, thanked the bystanders who helped her up, and walked on and boarded her boat, and only then, as the vessel pulled away, did she collapse, the tiny wound having pierced her heart. The most beautiful woman in the world, who had spent her life fleeing, died on the deck of a ship that was carrying her away. She was 60 years old. Sisi had been given everything you were given tonight, and a continent more besides, the palaces, the jewels, the adoration, the title that placed her above almost every other woman alive. And she had spent her entire life trying to claw her way back out of it, toward the forests and the freedom and the self she had been before the emperor looked at her across a room in Bad Ischl. She is remembered now as a romantic icon, her beauty endlessly painted and filmed and mourned. But the truer memory is of the cage, the most magnificent cage in Europe, and of a wild girl who was put inside it at 16 and never, despite all her wandering, found the way out. She had everything. It was never, for one single day, enough, because the one thing she wanted was the one thing the crown could not give, to be free. There was one country, though, where Sisi's caged heart came briefly, genuinely alive, and that country was Hungary. The Habsburg Empire was a restless patchwork of peoples, and the Hungarians chafed hardest of all under Viennese rule, and Sisi, who hated Vienna with all her wandering soul, found in proud, romantic, rebellious Hungary a mirror of her own longing to be free. She learned the difficult Hungarian language fluently, when almost no one at court would bother. She surrounded herself with Hungarian ladies and companions. She formed a deep and famous attachment to the Hungarian statesman Count Gyula Andrássy, a bond of genuine warmth and political alliance, perhaps something more, and she used what influence she had to push for reconciliation between the crown and the Hungarian people. When that reconciliation came, and Franz Joseph and Elizabeth were crowned King and Queen of Hungary in a glittering ceremony in Budapest, it was in many ways Sisi's one true political triumph, the one time the beautiful ghost reached into the machinery of empire and moved it. The Hungarians adored her for it, and adore her still. It was the closest she ever came to belonging anywhere. And there were other escapes, smaller and stranger. She wrote poetry, obsessively, melancholy verses steeped in her worship of the poet Heinrich Heine, filling notebooks with her loneliness and her longing and her dark, romantic dreams. She studied ancient and modern Greek and fell in love with Greece and its islands, building a palace on Corfu that she soon, restlessly, abandoned. She fenced. She kept up her punishing gymnastics into middle age. She doted, at last, on her youngest daughter, Marie Valerie, the one child the Archduchess Sophie had not been able to take from her, the one she was permitted to raise herself, and whom she loved with an almost suffocating intensity, as though pouring into this single child all the motherhood the court had stolen from her with the others. Sisi was not a simple romantic icon. She was a depressive, brilliant, impossible, grieving woman, fleeing across a continent from a sorrow she carried inside her, writing poems no one would read until long after she was gone, and growing, year by year, stranger and sadder and more remote. Our third woman bridges the two worlds we have visited tonight, the great houses of England and the gilded courts of Europe, and she carried between them a fortune so colossal that it could buy what no English duke any longer possessed: ready money. She was an American. She was the richest unmarried girl in the world. And she was sold, at 19, by her own ambitious mother, into a marriage with a duke she did not love and a palace she did not want. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt. She was born in 1877 into the Vanderbilt family, the great railroad dynasty of America's Gilded Age, heirs to one of the largest fortunes the world had ever seen. But money, in late 19th century New York, was not the same as acceptance. The old families of American society looked down upon the Vanderbilts as vulgar new arrivals, and Consuelo's mother, Alva, a woman of titanic will and boundless ambition, was determined to force her family up into the very highest ranks, by whatever means necessary. And the surest means, the oldest trick in the transatlantic playbook, was a title. There was, by the 1890s, a brisk and frankly brutal trade running across the ocean. Cash-rich American heiresses married to land-rich, but cash-poor British aristocrats. A swap of new money for old name that suited the calculating mothers on both shores. The girls were called dollar princesses. The newspapers loved them. The girls themselves were rarely consulted. Consuelo had the misfortune to be both immensely rich and genuinely lovely, and so she was groomed from girlhood to be the crown jewel of her mother's ambition. She grew up tall and graceful, with a long swan-like neck and a gentle nature, and she was educated, refined, and fatally for all his plans, in love. Consuelo had given her heart to a charming American named Winthrop Rutherford, and she wished, with all the quiet stubbornness of a shy girl, to marry him. Alva would not hear of it. She had selected a far grander destiny for her daughter, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, master of Blenheim Palace, one of the greatest houses in England, a cousin of the man who would one day be Winston Churchill, and a duke very much in need of an American fortune to keep his crumbling palace standing. What followed was less a courtship than a campaign of coercion that scandalizes even now. When Consuelo resisted, when she declared she loved another, and would not marry the duke, her mother is said to have locked her in her room, controlled her every movement, cut her off from Rutherford, and finally, by Consuelo's own later account, declared that the strain was making her, Alva, mortally ill, and that if Consuelo defied her and her mother died of it, the guilt would be Consuelo's forever. It was emotional warfare of the most ruthless kind, waged by a mother against her own 19-year-old daughter, and it worked. Worn down, isolated, terrified, Consuelo surrendered. She was married to the Duke of Marlborough in November of 1895, in a wedding that was one of the great society spectacles of the age. And the bride, the radiant dollar princess at the center of it all, spent the morning of her wedding weeping behind locked doors, and walked up the aisle with her face swollen from crying, hidden behind her veil. By her own telling, she wept behind that veil through the entire ceremony. The marriage settlement transferred a staggering fortune to the Duke and his estates. Blenheim Palace was saved. The Vanderbilts had their title at last. And a 19-year-old girl had been handed over, like a deed of property, to a man she barely knew and did not love, to live in a vast cold palace in a foreign country, far from everyone she cared for. And the palace was cold, in every sense. Blenheim was magnificent, enormous, and about as warm and welcoming as a museum after closing. The Duke, by Consuelo's account, was proud, formal, and distant, a man who had married her for her money and made little pretense otherwise. They dined together in stiff silence at opposite ends of a table so long that, she later wrote, she could barely make out his face, the two of them marooned in a sea of polished mahogany and footmen, with nothing to say. She did her duty, as the women of this story always did. She produced an heir and a spare 2 sons, securing the Marlborough line. And then, having performed the single function for which she had been purchased, she found herself a young woman in her 20s, immensely wealthy, a duchess, the mistress of one of the grandest houses in the world, and almost unbearably lonely, trapped in exactly the gilded cage you have lived inside tonight, with the gold polished to a higher shine than most. And what a cage it was! For Blenheim was not merely a house, but a monument, a vast Baroque palace of hundreds of rooms set in a park designed by the greatest landscape artists of England, a place built to overawe rather than to comfort, where you could walk for 10 minutes through staterooms and galleries without meeting another living soul. Consuelo performed the role of its duchess flawlessly, as she had been trained to do. She presided over the great dinners and house parties, received royalty, wore the famous Marlborough jewels and the heavy ducal coronet, and was painted by the master portraitists of the age, who set down for posterity that long swan-like neck and those enormous melancholy eyes, the very image of patrician grace. To the outside world, she was the supreme social prize, the American girl who had won the greatest title of all. And into that great cold house came, among the constant stream of relations, a brilliant, restless, ambitious young cousin of her husband's, a young man named Winston Churchill, then at the very start of his career, who would become her lifelong friend, and who liked and admired Consuelo enormously, and who would one day lead a nation. She moved among the most powerful people in the world. And she sat at the end of that endless dining table, night after night, looking down its polished length at a husband who had married her for her money. And she was as lonely as any woman has ever been, in a house with 100 fires lit, and not one of them warming her at all. But Consuelo had something Georgiana, in her century, had not, and that Sisi, in her court, could never quite grasp. She had been born American, in a newer and more restless age, and somewhere inside her gentle nature was a thread of her mother's iron that would, in time, set her free. She poured herself into work that mattered, into charity, into improving the lives of the poor on the vast estates, into the early causes of women's welfare and social reform. She found a purpose beyond being decorative. And eventually, she and the Duke did the once unthinkable thing. They separated in 1906, walking away from the marriage that had been forced upon them both. And years later, in an extraordinary twist, the marriage was formally annulled, and the chief witness to its coercion, the woman who testified that she had forced her daughter into it against her will, was none other than Alva herself, by then remarried and converted to the cause of women's suffrage, who admitted in plain terms that she had compelled the union. The mother who had built the cage helped, at the last, to unlock it. And Consuelo, freed at last, did something none of the women in tonight's stories were granted. She found happiness. She married again, this time entirely for love, to a French aviator and balloonist named Jacques Balsan, and lived with him in genuine contentment for decades, dividing her time between France and, later, America, devoting herself to charity and to her family. She lived a long, full, and finally chosen life, dying in 1964 at the age of 87, far from the cold corridors of Blenheim, surrounded by the love she had been denied at 19. And toward the end, she wrote her memoirs, and gave them a title that captures the whole of everything we have spoken of tonight. Every duchess, every empress, every heiress, every woman laced into a beautiful life she did not choose. She called her book, The Glitter and the Gold, because she had learned, better than almost anyone, the difference between the two, the glitter that the world sees, and envies, and dreams of, and the gold, the actual heavy metal of the cage, that you only feel once the doors have closed around you, and the smiling has to begin. It is worth lingering, before we let her go, on what Consuelo actually did with the long second half of her life, because it is the part the fairy tale always leaves out. What happens after the unhappy princess stops waiting to be rescued and simply rescues herself? Even in her years at Blenheim, trapped and lonely, she had not been idle or merely decorative. She was tall and graceful and famously lovely. The great portrait painters of the age, Sargent and Boldini, captured that long elegant neck and those grave dark eyes, and she became one of the most photographed and admired women in England. But she used her position for more than being looked at. She threw herself into charitable work, into the welfare of the poor, into prison reform, and the care of the sick and the housing of the destitute, discovering in herself a genuine social conscience that her gilded upbringing had never required of her. She became, by all accounts, a far better duchess to the people of the estate and the causes of the poor than the loveless marriage at the center of it all had any right to produce. And when the marriage finally ended, and the long process of separation and annulment ran its course, Consuelo did not retreat into bitterness. The annulment itself was an extraordinary thing, granted, in the end, on the grounds that she had been coerced into the marriage against her will, with her own mother Alva testifying, plainly and publicly, that she had forced her daughter to the altar. Imagine the strange, late justice of that. The woman who built the cage standing up before the world to swear that the cage had been built by force, so that her daughter might at last be free of it. By then Alva had become a fierce campaigner for women's right to vote, and there is a grim and fitting symmetry in it, that the iron will she had once used to imprison her daughter she turned, in her later years, toward the liberation of women in general, as if trying to pay back, on a vast scale, a debt she could never repay to the one woman she had wronged most. Freed, Consuelo married her French aviator, Jacques Balsan, and entered at last into the ordinary human happiness that had been stolen from her at 19, a marriage of genuine love that lasted until his death decades later. She lived through 2 world wars, did relief work, raised her sons, kept up her charities, moved between France and America, and grew old not as a tragic discarded duchess, but as a contented, useful, much-loved woman who had survived her own fairy tale and come out the far side of it into daylight. When she finally sat down to write her memoirs and called them The Glitter and the Gold, she was not writing as a victim. She was writing as a survivor, looking back with clear eyes on the dazzling, hollow, gilded thing she had escaped, and on the plain real happiness she had built in its place. Of all the women in our story tonight, She is the one who got out, and stayed out, and was glad. 3 women. A duchess, an empress, an heiress. Each handed the most envied life on earth, the life you wore like a gown tonight, and each made to learn in her own way what it truly cost. Georgiana turned her cage into a stage and dazzled a nation while drowning in secret. Sisi turned hers inward and wandered the earth in mourning, the most beautiful prisoner in the world. And Consuelo, the gentlest of the 3, was the one who, in the end, simply walked out the open door and went looking for an ordinary, unglamorous, freely chosen happiness, and found it. Perhaps that is the quiet moral hidden in all this velvet and candlelight, that the grandest life in the world is worth nothing at all if it is not your own, and that the smallest freely chosen one may be worth more than every diamond in the tower. And notice, as you drift, what all 3 of these women had in common, beneath their different centuries and their different crowns. Each was handed her gilded life young, far too young to choose it, or refuse it, or even understand it. Each was prized chiefly for what she could provide: a bloodline, an alliance, an heir, a fortune. Each was surrounded by more beauty and more comfort and more deference than almost any human being who has ever lived, and each discovered that none of it could give her the one thing a person actually needs, which is to be known, and loved, and free to spend her one short life on something of her own choosing. The diamonds did not do it. The palaces did not do it. The bowing crowds, and the painted portraits, and the envy of millions did not do it. And in that, strangely, these impossibly grand women are not so far from you at all, because the lesson their dazzling, tragic lives spell out in letters of gold is the plainest and most human lesson there is. That a life is measured not by what it looks like from the railing of the park, but by how it feels from the inside, in the quiet hours, when no one is watching and there is no one left to perform for. You have everything they had tonight. In a sense, you have lived their day, worn their gowns, carried their loneliness up the great staircase. And you have something not one of them, in all their splendor, was given freely. You have your own life, your own ordinary unglittering hours, yours to spend as you wish, answerable to no dynasty, laced into no one's expectations but your own. Georgiana would have wept for it. Sisi would have fled 100 palaces to taste it. Consuelo spent half a lifetime fighting her way toward exactly the quiet, unwatched freedom you are lying inside of, right now, this very moment, in the warm dark, with nothing required of you at all. So if there is a gift in these old stories, let it be that one, a small, warm gratitude for the gilded cages you do not have to live in, and for the plain and priceless freedom of a night that belongs to no one but you. But those are thoughts for the waking world, and you are not in the waking world now. You are here, in the warm dark, drifting, with the great house settling around you and the fire burning low. So let the duchesses go. Let the empresses and the heiresses go. Let the gowns dissolve, and the corset loosen, and the long staircase fade into shadow. You do not have to be magnificent tonight. You do not have to be watched, or admired, or assembled, or brave. You have no letters to write, no calls to pay, no table to turn, no smile to hold in place. There is no one here to perform for. There is only the dark, and the warmth, and the slow, easy rhythm of your own breath. Let your shoulders fall. Let the day go, the way the great houses let their candles go, one by one, until only the embers remain. The women in our story have all been asleep for 100 years and more now, their jewels in museums, their palaces full of tourists, their long, complicated, glittering lives gone quiet at last. And you, in your own bed, in your own time, free in ways no duchess of theirs could imagine, you can simply close your eyes. No cage, no crown, no cold marble stare. Just rest, freely chosen, freely given, yours and no one else's. Let the last of the great house fade now, the marble and the candlelight, the gowns and the jewels, the long staircase and the colder dawn beneath it, and let it all dissolve softly into the dark, the way 100 years dissolves, until there is nothing left but your own slow breathing and the gentle warmth of where you lie. Sleep now. Drift gently. There is nowhere you need to be, and no one you need to be, and the morning can wait as long as it likes. And we will meet again tomorrow night, with another quiet story from the past. Sweet dreams.